I never thought the family I bled for would be the ones to throw me out on the street, but that's exactly what happened 7 years after I first agreed to save them. Before we get into today's story, if you love stories filled with secrets, unexpected twists, and moments that keep you guessing, you're in the right place. This is Unfinished Tales. Subscribe now, because you never know what story is coming next. Now, let's get back to the story. My name is Nadia, and I lost my mother when I was 8 years old. My father, Walter, did his best in those first couple of years, but grief has a way of making a man reach for whatever steadies him fastest. And for Walter, that was Denise. He married her before I turned 11, and just like that, our house had a new woman running it and a new stepbrother, Kyle, sleeping down the hall. I quickly learned that Denise's side of the family had a way of making sure I knew whose house it really was now. Birthdays were smaller for me. Praise was thinner. My father noticed sometimes, and when he did, he fought for me quietly, in the way tired fathers do. Extra time, extra warmth, whispered reassurances that none of it was my fault. But nothing Denise did in those early years cut as deep as what she did the spring I turned 13. I came home from school to find my mother's jewelry box, one of the only things of hers I had left, sitting empty on my dresser, and Denise, standing in the doorway, explaining, almost cheerfully, that she'd donated some old clutter to make room for Kyle's trophies in the hall closet. My mother's wedding ring was in that box. I never saw it again, and Denise never once apologized, not even years later when I finally worked up the nerve to ask her about it. But my father also carried guilt over how fast he'd remarried, and Denise knew exactly how to use it. The week I turned 18, she sat me down and, in front of my father, made it sound less like a request and more like a debt I owed the household. Help keep this family afloat, the way your father has, the way a real daughter would. I didn't know then that agreeing to that would mean 7 years of my paycheck disappearing into other people's mistakes. At first, it was small. Groceries here, a utility bill there. I told myself I was doing it for her, not for them. Walter had lost his footing after the funeral, and Denise's business, a struggling little hair salon on the east side of town, was barely staying open. When the landlord raised the rent that same year, I was the one who quietly started paying it in full, every month, straight to his account. Someone had to hold the roof up, and grief has a way of making you believe that someone has to be you, literally. But grief also blinds you to the exact moment when help turns into being used, and I walked straight past that moment without noticing. By year 3, I wasn't just covering bills, I was covering debts I didn't know existed. A new washing machine appeared in the garage that I never bought. A family emergency fund credit card got maxed out on a vacation I wasn't invited on. When I asked questions, Denise would sigh like I was the unreasonable one, and Walter would change the subject to something about honoring my mother's memory. I told myself it was fine. I told myself family doesn't keep score. I was wrong on both counts, and the truth was already sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, waiting for someone to open it. That someone turned out to be me, on a Tuesday night, when a collections letter addressed to me arrived for an account I had never opened in my life. My hands shook when I read the letter. Not from fear, from the sudden, sick clarity of finally seeing something I had refused to see for years. I didn't confront anyone that night. I did something far more dangerous. I stayed quiet, and I started paying attention. Over the next several months, I built a file. Bank statements, old mail I'd been told was nothing important. Screenshots of accounts opened in my name that I traced back, one by one, to Kyle's spending habits and Denise's salon expenses. My best friend Reggie, a paralegal who had watched this slow unraveling from the outside for years, helped me organize it all into something that looked less like a suspicion and more like a case. Every fraudulent charge I found made the next one easier to believe and harder to forgive. I still don't know exactly what made me finally say no out loud. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was finally doing the math and realizing how much of my future I had already spent on their present. Whatever it was, when Denise asked me to co-sign a business loan to expand the salon, a request delivered less like a favor and more like an obligation, something in me simply stopped bending. I said no, calmly, for the first time in 7 years. I did not expect what happened in the next 60 seconds. If you've ever had to say no to someone who was counting on you never finding the courage, drop a comment below because Nadia's about to find out exactly what that costs her. Denise's face changed before I even finished the sentence. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. For a moment, she just stared at me, and then her hand came across my face before I even registered she'd moved. A sharp, stinging slap that snapped my head to the side and rang in my ear long after the sound of it faded. Walter was standing right there in the hallway, close enough to have stopped it, and he didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched from a few feet away, the way he always did whenever Denise decided something needed handling, and said absolutely nothing. I stood there with my hand pressed to my cheek, more stunned than hurt, while Denise straightened her blouse like she'd simply swatted away an insect. "Then get out," she said, flat and final, like she'd been waiting years for an excuse. "If you're not going to help this family, you don't get to live under its roof." I actually let out a short, disbelieving laugh. The roof she meant was one I paid for, and the hand she'd just raised belonged to a woman who owed me more than she'd ever admit. But Denise wasn't interested in irony. She was already calling for Kyle to bring down my suitcase from the hall closet, moving through the house like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head. It should have destroyed me. Instead, it did the opposite. It freed me from the last thread of guilt keeping me tied to that house. I packed 2 suitcases while Kyle watched from the hallway, arms crossed, saying nothing, and Walter still hadn't moved from where he'd been standing when it happened, staring at the floor now instead of at me. My younger step-sibling Devin, the only one in that house who had ever treated me like an actual sister, stood in my doorway with tears in his eyes, one hand still half raised like he'd wanted to step between us and hadn't been fast enough, asking if I was really leaving. I told him yes. What I didn't tell him was that I already had a plan, and it had nothing to do with revenge, only with finally protecting myself. The next morning, before I even found a new place to stay, I made 2 phone calls. One was to the landlord, to let him know I would no longer be covering the rent on that house, effective immediately. The other was to Reggie, to tell her it was time to finish what we'd started. For years, I had quietly stood between that family and the consequences of their own choices. Now I simply stepped aside and let them meet those consequences face to face. The landlord, a patient man named Mr. Bennett, who had dealt with me directly for years and never once with Denise or Walter, gave the family a standard notice: pay within the week or vacate. Nobody in that house had ever actually managed the rent themselves, and it showed. The week came and went with no payment, because there was no plan, only panic. 3 days after the notice expired, Devin called me, his voice shaking, and told me 2 men were on the porch nailing up an eviction order, while Denise screamed at them from the doorway that there had to be some mistake. There was no mistake. There was only 7 years of math finally landing on the people who had never once done it themselves. By the end of that week, Walter called me, the first time he'd called in months. I almost didn't answer. When I did, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard since before he married Denise: humility. He didn't ask me to come back. He asked me, quietly, if there was anything I could do to buy them a little more time with the landlord, just until they figured something out. I told him I couldn't, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty saying it. Denise called 2 days later, and there was no pride left in her voice at all, just the flat, desperate tone of someone who had run out of other people to blame. She asked, almost begged, if I would speak to Mr. Bennett on their behalf, reminding him what a good tenant our family had always been. I had to point out, gently, that she had never once met him. For the first time in 7 years, the truth wasn't sitting quietly in a drawer. It was standing on their front porch in a moving truck, loading up whatever they hadn't already sold. I thought that would be the end of it. A hard lesson, a family forced to face its own mess. I was wrong. Denise wasn't done trying to control the story, and what she did next nearly cost me my job. She called my employer and filed a complaint, accusing me of financial misconduct, twisting the entire situation to make herself the victim. I sat in my supervisor's office 2 days later, listening to accusations that bore no resemblance to the truth, and felt something in me go cold and very, very focused. If they wanted a fight built on lies, I was going to answer it with a fight built entirely on facts. I hired an attorney named Diane, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who looked at my file of statements and screenshots and told me, flatly, that this wasn't a family dispute. It was fraud, plain and documented. For the first time since my mother's death, someone was looking at my life and calling it exactly what it was. But even Diane admitted we needed one more piece to make the case undeniable, and it came from the person I least expected to risk everything for me. Devin, 17 years old and still living under Denise's roof, had secretly recorded a conversation weeks earlier, back when the family was casually discussing which of my accounts to use next. He'd been carrying it on his phone for months, unsure what to do with it, afraid of what it meant for the only home he'd ever known. When he finally handed it over, his hands were shaking worse than mine had been the night I opened that first collections letter. The recording was devastating in its casualness, Denise and Kyle discussing my credit like a shared resource, laughing about how easy it was, certain I would never notice, or never push back. Diane said it was the kind of evidence attorneys dream about, unscripted, undeniable, and utterly damning. Once that recording was in Diane's hands, the outcome of this story was no longer something Denise or Walter could talk their way out of. The investigation moved fast after that. Creditors were notified, fraud claims were filed, every account opened without my consent was formally disputed, and one by one, they began disappearing from my credit report like weightlifting off my chest. But the real collapse wasn't financial. It happened somewhere much quieter, inside that house. Denise's salon, already barely afloat, folded within months, unable to survive without the steady infusion of money that had quietly been mine. Walter, forced for the first time in years to look honestly at the family's finances, finally saw what I had been carrying alone, and what it had cost to lose it all at once: the rent, the salon, and eventually the house itself. To cover what was left of their debts, they sold off the few things still worth anything: Walter's old truck, a small piece of land his own father had left him, and whatever equipment remained from Denise's salon, and moved into a small, weathered house on the outskirts of town, the kind with a sagging porch and a yard nobody had the money or the will to tend to anymore. Kyle, stripped of the safety net he never knew he depended on, was left facing bills with no one left to rescue him. I didn't celebrate their downfall. I simply stopped standing underneath it. 6 months later, my credit report was clean, my name was finally my own again, and Devin had moved in with me, choosing, at 17, to leave the only house he'd ever known, rather than stay in one built on lies. We rebuilt slowly: a small apartment, steady jobs, Sunday dinners that felt nothing like the ones I grew up with, and everything like what family was supposed to feel like. Denise once told me that a real daughter would help keep this family afloat. It took me 7 years and 1 collections letter to understand what being a real daughter actually looks like. And it was never about paying someone else's debts. It was Devon, choosing me over the only house he'd ever known. It was my father, finally seeing me clearly once the noise died down. Family, I learned, isn't the one you're told you owe. It's the one you build once you stop paying for the one that never wanted you. Wait, you're not leaving without subscribing, are you? Subscribe to Unfinished Tales for more shocking twists, unforgettable characters, and stories you won't see coming.